With Barack Obama or even with George W. Bush, you could actually gesture toward this reaction from someone whose job it is to be some sort of national consoler, because it's certainly not mine. But there's an absence of a moral center to the United States under the Trump presidency. So anytime there was a moral crisis for America, whatever it is, I desperately missed that person to be able to point at.
So I know this next question is probably going to be a little bit difficult because there were so many moments, but I wanted, to ask you, what do you think was the worst moment of the Trump presidency? Or I would let me just slightly amend that. Worst moment in which you had to the combination of what was his worst moment that you then go on air to try to make sense, kind of for people. What would you say was kind of like the worst, where, as you're relaying to the audience, like, this is some terrible shit?
That is an all-you-can-eat buffet.
Yeah, it's a hard question because there's so many moments to pick from.
I'm gonna name several just off the top of my head without being, and then maybe one of them will rise to the top here. I would say finding out that he had won the election on election night in 2016 was pretty terrible. We were live. There was no getting the camera off me. It was on Showtime. There was no commercial breaks. The camera was just on me. There was no escaping my emotional reaction in that moment. And I had a monologue at the end of the show, and I ended up throwing almost the entire thing away and just improvising. Improvising isn't quite the word, just speaking from the heart for the last 10 minutes of the show, and eventually finding my way to what the comedic premise at the end was. And that was a terrifying moment to be part of. But I also knew that there was nothing to do other than just feel it, because what else are you going to do as an artist but just feel it back at the audience? And the unsung hero of that moment, the MVP, was my longtime prompter operator, Michelle Decker. She followed me on the prompter, seeing if there was any point at which I was going to dip back into the script. And she was sliding up and down, and she seamlessly knew where I was going. She seemed to somehow sense, without ever talking about what part of the script I might keep, and was always there. She could feel where it was. And that's an interesting dance that people never get to see. But I know that everybody who does this has to have like an intimate relationship with that person if they're ever going to go off script. I would say, any of those moments that were not related to Trump specifically, but were moments of tragedy, that mass shootings, nightclubs in Florida, or schools in Florida, or places of worship around the United States, businesses, like any of those moments when because the mandate we have for ourselves is, what is the national conversation today? Everybody has a feeling about it. I'm going to go on stage tonight. I'm going to talk about, well, what was my feeling about this thing that we were all feeling about? Because feeling is really first. We make, arguments and we have rationales, but it's all about how we feel today. That's what the show is about. And so that, under his administration, was additionally hard, because you can't really make jokes about tragedy and you want to approach it sensitively, but also he's of no help whatsoever. He is in no way you can point to. With Barack Obama or even with George W. Bush, you could actually gesture toward this reaction from someone whose job it is to be some sort of national consoler, because it's certainly not mine. But there's an absence of a moral center to the United States under the Trump presidency. So anytime there was a moral crisis for America, whatever it is, I desperately missed that person to be able to point at. And in terms of himself, again, there are way too many of them, but I would say the night that, 2 days after the election, when he went on and said, let's make no mistake, I won, I won, this is all rigged, that shocked me. We'd already done everything in the show except the monologue, because sometimes for technical reasons, because of guests, we have to do it backwards. And I was about to do the monologue, and he went on and gave that press conference. And what shocked me was that I did not know, as little as I expect to get what I think is proper leadership in that direction, I was quite surprised that I was heartbroken by it. I didn't realize I had that left. just for the office itself. And that might have been the hardest night specifically related to him. And the odd thing about it is that the very first night he was elected, I couldn't sit down that night. If you look at the film for Showtime, I can't sit down. I talk for 10 minutes standing up. And that the last night that I talked about him specifically, because I haven't said his name since that night, is on the show, is I couldn't sit down, and I didn't know why. I just can't sit down. It wasn't later until I realized, oh, the very first night, the very last night, I'm just so mad. I'm so heartbroken. Sitting down seems too passive. So, that's a long answer, and there's so many different times in between, but I would say those 2 nights were the hardest, associated specifically about what he meant to the damage that could be inflicted by such a moral void on our nation.
I feel like this was an omen, and it perfectly surmised, I guess, what that presidency ultimately meant. So people are listening right now, so they won't get to see this, and maybe we'll show this on social media. But as you were talking and giving what I thought was a very thoughtful answer, a bird took a shit on my iPad because I am outside in my backyard, and a bird literally took a shit on my iPad. And I was like, you know what? That pretty much summed up the Trump presidency. I was like, here I am having this engaging, thoughtful conversation with Stephen Colbert, and a bird takes a shit on my iPad that has, my questions that I have for you and everything. I was like, this is very appropriate.
It's good luck.
Yeah, I'm going to choose to see it that way, and just be thankful it wasn't my hair, because you might have seen an entirely different freak out that occurred if that was the case. I saw you, so in prep for this interview, I actually went back and watched I believe this is the only interview with Trump that you've done. Was it 2015? Was that right?
Yeah, I had met him before, but that's the only time I interviewed him.
That's the only time you interviewed him?
Yeah.
I read that you said that of all the interviews that you had, that's the one you would not do again, as in interviewing him again. Do you still feel that way?
Yeah, even more so. I think it might be irresponsible to give him attention. That's why I don't like. We're going to deal with the effects of his presidency. I mean, even the recent rise of threats to the Asian American community is like it's the tail. That's the tail off of his presidency. That's the stink in the room. That's going to take a while to clear out if we make the effort to do so, and along with many other things. But so there's no avoiding him as a subject, but he shouldn't be a central subject, because I think that merely empowers him in some way. So that's why I don't like saying his name or showing his picture or stuff like that, if possible. And I've paid my debt to that already. But specifically, now let's put that aside. Just as a host, this is kind of boring, in the same way that O'Reilly was kind of boring, because they're one way with their crowd, and then they come to your crowd and they play the reasonable man, which is really a form of cowardice. That's
what struck me about the interview with you, is that
how reasonable he was.
It was not the same Trump that we were used to kind of seeing.
It wasn't the guy saying Mexicans are sending rapists. It's not that guy.
No, he wasn't.
My brother Ed was there that night, and my brother Ed came up to me afterwards and he goes, you know what? That's not a dumb guy. He knew that he couldn't play that game with this audience and get anything out of it. But I don't really want people who are going to play any kind of game with my audience. I just want them to express the thing that they're famous for. That's it. If you've got the balls to say someplace else, say it here. That's essentially why he's not worth talking to, because he's essentially boring. Because you always know what he's going to say. Even if he is himself, you already know what the answer is going to be. Even if he was to cut loose, he wouldn't ever say anything that surprised you, only upset you. And who wants to do that?
Fair point. of the many things we are left to deal with in the wake of his presidency, although I would argue that this was an issue beforehand, but now we're looking around at the after effects and the wreckage left by the presidency. And one of those was what has just basically happened to our democracy. Um, what are your thoughts on whether or not our democracy, do you feel like it's bent, it's broken, or is at a point where it might not even be salvageable?
Oh, I think it's salvageable because the nature of a constitutional democracy is that it's meant to be changeable. Whether we will, I don't know, but certainly the founders built it with a mechanism to change it if you wanted to, if you had the will to do so. It remains to see whether we do. For instance, like the Senate is the least democratic aspect that contains the least democratic tool, which is the filibuster, which results in the American Rescue Plan just got passed with a 50-50 vote or 49-50 vote, but the people who voted for it, that half voted for it, represent 45 million more people than the other half. So there's something broken there. That's clear. And I'd be afraid to open up the Constitution to change it at this point. I feel like the Constitution it's not even a life raft. It's like a bubble. We got to keep it safe for like the toxic sludge that's floating in. If we go in there to try to fix it, that sludge is going to get into the Constitution, is what worries me. I've given hope by the number of people who've turned out to vote. That's not insignificant. More people voted than in a higher percentage, not even more people, higher number than ever, higher percentage than over 100 years. That's got to give you some hope that people haven't given up on it. And democracy is only the people. So if the people haven't given up on it, you have no right to give up on democracy.